All right, welcome to Chapter 4, Open Source Software and Licensing. Now, before we really get into what licensing is and licensing agreements and everything else, we need to understand what software is itself, and what makes up the software. And that would be the source code. All right, this is the underlying thing that makes the software do what it's actually expected to do. And source code is, in itself, human readable. All right, so just to the right here, I have a little bit of source code. Not 100% sure what this is from. It looks to me kind of like JavaScript or something along those lines, but I could be way wrong. I am not the best programmer out there. But anyway, it is human readable within reasons. So that's someone who has dealt with that programming language, whatever this is, can read this and understand what it's supposed to do. All right. However, a computer cannot understand it. It is not directly understood by that computer. The computer needs it to be compiled. And what compiled means is that we're going to take those instructions, those human readable source code, and we're going to convert that using a compiler to something that the computer actually understands. Like, oh, I'm supposed to do this, then whatever the case is. All right. So we have source code that we as humans can read and understand if you've dealt with the language, or even if you haven't dealt with the language, but you've dealt with something close, you probably have a decent idea of what's going on. And then that gets compiled, as I said, into something, so into machine instructions that the computer understands. Um, and that's the big thing here, the source code. It's something that we, as I said, understand, and it's definitely very important to have access to that source code for many different reasons. And there are many reasons that you shouldn't have access to it as well. So there's definitely a bit of a give and take going on here. Let's say you wanted to interact with the software. Well, if you had the source code, you could read it, you could modify it, you could make it so you could interact with it. One way that developers will keep you from needing access to that source code is to have an API, and that is an application programming interface. And this allows programs to easily interface to each other. All right, so there's a standardized way that software A can ask software B for information, and software B will then reply with that information. So the API is a very necessary interface. It is definitely a super important thing. Like one of the reasons we need this is printing. Let's just use that as an example on your computer. If every program had to have its own printing system implemented, um, you'd have basically the same printing information on 100 different installed on your computer 100 different times because every different program would have its own different interface and how it works and all these other fun things. Um, and that would just be basically wasted space because they're all basically doing the same thing. They're taking the file and they're printing it. So what Windows has done, and Mac and Linux and every other company out there who has a OS that needs printing, they've created a printing software that has an API, so they can say, hey, programs, ask me to print something, and I can print it for you, basically. So there's a certain information that the API needs that the different applications will spit out to it, and then they can say, okay, thanks, and they can turn around and then spit that back out into whatever other instance. So it's a very important thing, the API. It does allow, basically, if you know what's going on, anyone to use this. Now, sometimes the APIs, they are very well publicly published, right? It's just like, okay, here's the code, do what you want with it, type of thing. Sometimes the APIs are there, but they haven't published what they actually do, or what requests need to be made, or whatever the case is. They only might even say it's there. It's there, but they might not say it's there. And the reason being they don't want everybody using it. They want to be able to use it themselves for an app or something, but they don't want the whole world to use it. And this is actually a case recently with some home automation stuff, and I think it was an air conditioner or something like that, where someone had reverse engineered the API. They knew the API was there. They figured out what was getting sent to it, what formats and things, and then they started using it for their own purposes. So that is something that happens. I'm not saying it's the best thing, but it is there. Companies should really just make the APIs accessible to everybody and make everybody's lives easier, as far as I'm concerned. And the API is kind of like a standardization. It is something that allows everything to work together. And standardizations are definitely going to be necessary. A great example of this is comments. So what you see here in green on the screen is the comments for this code that's saying this is what we're doing, this is why we're doing it. So it is very important to have comments in your code as a standard because that allows other people to understand your code easier and be able to more quickly modify it if necessary. And this has happened to me personally. I've done my own programming for my home automation stuff, and I've got my program working. I think it's all, perfect and fine. Not perfect, working, acceptably with some slight problems. And I'm like, okay, we're good, we're done, it works, I'm happy, and I close the program. And a few months later, I'm like, oh, let me add a different something to it, or I actually have time to work on it again to improve it, or whatever the case is. And I haven't looked at it in a long time. Now I have to read all the code, understand what's going on, why I'm using certain things, why something is formatted that way, how I learned to do that because I'm self-taught for programming. Um, and it takes a lot more time. So even though it's my own code that I've written, months later, you still go back and read things. You're like, what is the point of this? So adding comments as a standard makes it very easy for me to go back later in my code and read it and go, okay, I need to modify this or add that, or this is what this is doing and why it's necessary. So commenting is very important for standardization. There are many different standardizations out there for organizations, that is. One of them that you might interact with for computers and electronics is the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers. That's IEEE. You also have the Portable Operating Systems Interface, or POSIX, I believe is how that is pronounced. Now, as part of this, open source and everything is licensing, and there's two main different groups. You have the closed source section, and you have the open source section. And I just have a licensing over here. It's a contract allowing party to use and/or earn revenue from the property of someone else. All right, that's in a nutshell what licensing is. But we'll come back to the closed versus open in a few minutes. So, components of buying software, there's ownership. All right, and the question here is who actually owns the intellectual property behind the software? You, as the purchaser, rarely get ownership unless you are paying like an exorbitant amount of money for that. So that way you can then make money off of it. Normally, what you get is a license to use the software. All right, and this is actually definitely one of those things that has changed in the last probably 5-10 years. But back in the olden days, all right, you used to buy CDs. Yeah, I'm not going that old. We're just sticking with CDs. And that had your music on it. So you'd go into the music store and you buy a CD and you got 13 tracks or whatever the magic number was that was on that CD. You probably only cared about like one or two of them, but you couldn't just buy one or two. You had to buy the whole CD. And you owned that CD. You could lend it to friends. You could use it as a frisbee. You could listen to it. You could play it on, whatever the case is. You basically owned that CD and you had most of the rights. Now, you didn't have the rights to do certain things with it, like rip the music and upload it to the internet for free. You couldn't do that. But as long as the CD transitioned with whoever was listening to music, you were basically in the fine, as far as I understood, at least. However, nowadays we go through app stores to buy music, and you normally can buy just one song at a time. It's like, oh, $2 for that song. Yeah, okay, I can buy that. Where it might have been like $20 to buy a CD beforehand. So there's definitely a little bit of give and take going on there. But nowadays, that license is for you and you only. You can't loan that song out to a friend. You can't do things that you think you should be able to do with it. It's like, well, you don't truly own it. You just own the use of it for your lifetime, basically. And it's non-transferable normally, and it's many things like that. One of the things that drives me most nuts is like ebooks. Their licenses is, again, it's like, okay, yeah, you own this. You go to a bookstore, you buy the book, you own it, it's yours. You can do again what you want with it. You can read it, and then you can sell the book to somebody else, and they can read it and sell it, and you can just kind of keep passing that same book around. Ebooks, you can't do that. I think on the Amazon for the Kindles, you might get one share. Like you might be able to share that Kindle ebook with one other person, not like one person at a time. No, it's just like you can share it to your friend once, and then that's it, type of thing. And to me, I'm like, but I paid for the book. But again, it's all about the licensing that you agreed to when you bought the book. So that's kind of one of the big things there is ownership. Who actually owns this? Another thing is money. All right. How does money change hands, if at all? All right. And this does depend on the model of the creator, so what licensing they went with. And this is probably one of the big differences between open source and from proprietary is money. All right. Not all open source things are free, all right, or free cost-wise at least. But we'll come back to that one a little bit. And the last one is licensing. So what do you actually get? What does the license say? What can you do with that software? Can you use it on one computer? Can you use it on multiple computers? Can you install it on all the computers as long as you're only using it on one computer at a time? So it's a very interesting game that is being played here. The other question with licensing is, can you give it away to somebody else? Can you, again, loan that CD out, type of thing? So, and licensing is normally your EULA, your end user licensing agreement. All right. So for average consumer products, it is going to be a single computer that you can install it on. You don't get copies. You're not allowed to reverse engineer the program, and you might get minor updates, but you're not going to get major upgrades. All right. And before you can basically use any software, you have to agree to this EULA, this end user license agreement. And one of my favorite sayings is from Louis Rossman is EULA roofing. Basically, like, well, you want to use our software, and you have to agree to all these crazy terms. And it's like, but if I don't agree with those, but I need to use this software for something, or they've put something in that EULA that is on the 28th printed page, like if you were to print the whole license agreement out, and it's all the way down there, and they're like, no one's going to get down here to actually read and understand what we're saying here. All right. Which is really kind of one of the big pains here with EULAs as far as I'm concerned. Another thing I like to say is they're in legalese, where it's like, okay, it's there, yes, but do I actually understand what it's saying? All right, so that would be your average consumer product. Now we also have some other licensing EULAs that are out there. There's the GNU, the General Public License, and this is the General Public License version 2 or GPLv2, and so this is part of the GNU, and there are multiple different versions of this. And part of the GNU licensing is that source code must be made available to anyone who asks. So it doesn't necessarily have to be available like just on a website for you to download, but if you were to contact the company and say, hey, I want to copy the source code and you're using the GNU license, then you must supply that source code to them. It also says that anyone is allowed to make changes. So just because you've given it to them, that might not mean that's allowed to change it, but according to this license agreement, yes, they are. They can change it, they can tweak it, they can distribute it. That's fine. That's all allowed under this license. So it's a very interesting game here. But if you do redistribute that software, you have to use the same license. So it's not like you can get the software from somewhere, tweak it, and then now use it under a different license and start trying to sell it and keep it closed source. No, that's not allowed. All right, but you can make these changes to it. And you also are not for under the GNU. You're not allowed to charge for distribution other than physical cost of media and transport. So again, like you want to distribute this as a CD, you could charge, well, the CD cost me $1, shipping cost me $5, so it's going to cost you $6 to get the software. Yes, it's free, but it still costs me something to mail that CD to you. So you actually can charge for those things, but you can't say like, well, I've spent 24 hours in this and it's $50 an hour, so that's X amount of dollars. No, that you can't do. So definitely kind of interesting. You also have FOSS, which is the free and open source software. This is normally the creator has the right to decide how it is when it is distributed. So this is not that technically a EULA, which is kind of interesting. And they also can have a custom one. And you can create your own EULA if you would want. It is often easier to use something that's already been created, and you might want to research all your different options out there. And there are a lot of options. We will come back. We're going to come to some of these in a little bit. So there's a lot of different options out there. So really, you need to go research what it is that you think is important to your release and those types of things. So one of those things that those options that we're going to talk about is the Free Software Foundation, and this was started by Richard Stallman, which is the guy in this picture right about next to the penguin, and that was founded in 1985, and his goal of promoting free software. All right, now what does free mean? Well, not necessarily price. All right. But how you choose to use the software. So again, it's like, okay, I could charge you for the software, but once you have it, you can kind of do whatever you want with it per se. All right, so a little give and take on there. The license that you're going to use with this should allow openness to modification. So again, it's like, okay, once you bought software, you want to modify it, you can modify it. You're allowed to do that. All right. And one of the big things they have is copyleft, which says you are welcome to modify, but any modifications you make, you must share. All right. And this is one of those big things there. It's like, okay, yeah, sure, here's the software. You changed it. Cool. Now just post it as a fork on GitHub saying, okay, here's a modification that I made. All right. And if everyone likes that modification, maybe we'll bring it into the main distribution of that now. All right. And the FSF does have multiple different licensing it does do now, which is GPLv2, GPLv3, LPGLv2, and LGPLv3 as well. So there's a lot going on there with the Free Software Foundation. You also have OSI, and we're not talking about the networking layers here. We're talking about the Open Source Initiative, and this was founded in 1998 by Bruce Pernins and Eric Raymond. All right, and they believed that no restrictions should be placed on the use of the software. That source code should be available. So basically, again, you can kind of do whatever you want with it. It does not have its own set of licenses like the FSF has, though. Whatever it has is like a set of principles, and it adds some licenses to that, and that meets those principles, and they call those the open source licenses. And this is somewhat based off of the BSD, uses the BSD, the Berkeley Software Distribution. It's an open source license. It's much simpler than the GPL, which was also on the last page. You may just redistribute, but don't say the original developer endorses your work. So in other words, do what you want with the software, just don't say that you wrote it. And one thing that they had here was, since free is confusing, all right? It's like, well, it's free. What do you mean by free? Like, I don't have to pay for it. I can do what I want with it. What does that mean? So this was part of the FOSS, the free open source software. So FOSS now is FLOSS, which is the free liberate open source software. So liberate as in like freedom to do what you want, not free as in cost. So interesting there. We also have Creative Commons. Creative Commons, though, is not for software. Creative software is for those like graphic designs and like 3D models and things like that. Things that you are like a graphic designer would make. And so this is not for software. It's like FOSS, but not. It isn't FOSS. And there's a lot of conditions that go along with this. And this picture over here on the right is really, really quite good. So we have lots of icons, terms of the license, and some conditions. So we have the attribution, which would be BY, which that would be this person right there. All right. As that says, all Creative Commons licenses require that the creator must be given credit without implying that the creator endorses the use. All right. You have share alike, which is SA, which allows others to copy, distribute, form, and modify the work, provided they not do so in the same terms. You have non-commercial, which is basically saying, as long as you're not using it commercially, you can use it. And then you have non-derivative, which says that this allows others to distribute, display, and perform only original copies of the work. They must obtain the creator's permission to modify it. So it's like, you really like that cell phone holder that you found on Thingiverse that you could 3D print. And it's Creative Commons, but it's non-derivative, so that means you can't modify it without asking them to do it. So definitely a little bit of give and take going on there. And then last, we have the open source business model. And the question is, how are we going to make money with this? All right. If everything is supposed to be free and open and you can download it and redistribute it and do all this, it's like, how does anyone make money off these things? And many people don't. They do this for a hobby. They do this because this is something that they made, and they're like, well, let me distribute out there and see what people think of it. And if it becomes popular, great. One way you can make money off this is just people giving you donations. You're like, hey, this software is taking me a lot of time. Send me a cup of coffee, or they got those little donations for a few bucks here, a few bucks there. And some people are like, this is great. Here's $100. And that's one way that you can make money. You could also put ads into it. Now again, if it's open source, that means you could find the source code, take the ads out, and you wouldn't have the ads anymore. But who's gonna want to do that to recompile it to make it work? And there's so many people out there that will, but not all of them will. So another way you can do that is with support and warranty. So you can say, okay, yeah, hey, here's the software. It's free to use, free to do what you like with. If you need support, though, if you're going to be asking me questions, there's going to be a cost associated with that, because now it's actively using me more time. I built this in my free time. I don't have free time to support you and 12,000 other people. So if you want support, we now have to have a cost. You also might have an extra hardware associated with that device. A great example of this would be like TiVo, where you used to be record the TV. I believe that was free open source software, but the hardware that went along with it had a cost. So there is some ways that you can make money per se off of stuff still being open source. All right. And that's kind of my little quick overview of open source software licensing and things.